Silas Ward had seen plenty of wrong things in his 43 years, but nothing had prepared him for what stood chained to the post outside Jennings's general store. The young native girl couldn't have been more than 18. Iron shackles around her wrists, her dark eyes staring straight ahead as townspeople walked past like she was part of the wooden furniture. What shocked him more than her presence was how normal everyone treated it. Mothers pulling their children closer, men tipping their hats to Otis Jennings, who stood nearby counting coins, the girl herself standing still as carved stone. Silas dismounted his horse slowly, his weathered hands gripping the reins tighter than necessary. The main street of Cedar Hollow buzzed with its usual afternoon commerce, but something felt deliberately orchestrated about the scene before him. 3 days he'd been away checking his north pasture, and now this. The girl wore what remained of traditional native dress, torn and stained, her long black hair hanging loose around shoulders that trembled slightly, despite her rigid posture. He approached the general store entrance, forcing his steps to remain casual. Otis Jennings glanced up from his coin counting, that familiar merchant smile spreading across his round face. The man had always struck Silas as too eager to please, too quick with explanations nobody asked for. "Afternoon, Silas. Fine weather we're having." Silas nodded toward the girl without meeting Jennings' eyes. "What's this about?" Jennings's smile flickered, just for a moment. "Oh, her? Legal acquisition. Got the papers right inside if you're curious. She's helping with some work around town." His fingers drummed against the wooden counter he'd set up outside. Nothing for folks to worry about. The girl's eyes met Silas's then, and he saw something that made his chest tighten. Not pleading, not desperation, but a kind of resigned awareness that cut deeper than any cry for help. She knew exactly what was happening to her. Worse, she'd accepted it. Silas felt his jaw clench involuntarily. What kind of work requires chains? The question hung in the air between them. Jennings's drumming fingers stopped. Around them, the normal sounds of town life continued, but Silas noticed how conversations had grown quieter, how several townspeople had found reasons to linger nearby. Dr. Morrison emerged from his office across the street, his medical bag in hand, but stopped when he saw the gathering. "Well," Jennings cleared his throat, "sometimes folks need guidance, structure. You know how it is with their kind." Those last words struck Silas like a physical blow. He'd heard that phrase before, usually preceding something that made his stomach turn. His eyes found the girl's again, and this time he saw the slightest shake of her head. A warning. Jennings was still talking, something about legal documents and territorial authority, but Silas wasn't listening anymore. He was studying the chain that connected her wrists to the post, noting its weight, its position. He was observing the way Sheriff Hargrove had appeared at the edge of his vision, and resting casually on his gun belt. Most importantly, he was remembering his father's last words before consumption took him. Sometimes a man's got to choose between being comfortable and being able to sleep at night. The girl's eyes widened slightly as she watched understanding dawn in his face. She shook her head again, more urgently this time, but Silas Ward had already made his choice. The question now was whether Cedar Hollow was ready for the consequences. Silas walked directly to his horse and pulled a pair of wire cutters from his saddlebag. The tool felt heavier than usual in his weathered hands as he turned back toward the chained girl. Around him, the casual afternoon bustle of Cedar Hollow began to shift into something more tense and watchful. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Footsteps slowed. Even the horses seemed to sense the change in the air. "Now hold on there, Silas." Sheriff Hargrove's voice carried the practiced authority of 20 years wearing a badge. His boots clicked against the wooden sidewalk as he approached, hand still resting on his gun belt. "You don't want to be interfering with official business." Silas didn't stop walking toward the girl. "Official business? Show me the papers." Jennings fumbled inside his vest, producing a folded document with theatrical flourish. "Right here, all legal and proper. Territorial statute allows for rehabilitation services." The girl's eyes darted between the approaching men, her breathing growing more rapid. Silas noticed small details that made his blood run cold. Rope burns on her ankles beneath the iron shackles, a fresh bruise along her collarbone, the way she instinctively leaned away when Jennings moved closer. Dr. Morrison crossed the street, his medical bag clutched tightly. The older man's face was grim as he took in the scene. "Gentlemen, perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private." "Nothing to discuss, Doc." Hargrove's voice had lost its casual tone. "Everything here is perfectly legal." Silas reached the post and knelt beside the girl's chains, examining the lock mechanism. She whispered something so quietly only he could hear. "They have others." The words hit him like a physical blow. Others. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a system. His mind raced through recent changes in town he'd dismissed as unimportant. New faces he'd seen briefly and then never again. Conversations that stopped when he entered the saloon. The way certain townspeople had suddenly acquired expensive new clothes and equipment. Step away from her, Ward. Hargrove's gun was now visible in his hand, though not yet pointed directly at Silas. "This doesn't concern you." Silas stood slowly, the wire cutters still in his grip. Around them, a circle of townspeople had gathered, but their faces showed an odd mixture of curiosity and something else. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "Where are the others?" Silas asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. The question sent a visible ripple through the crowd. Several people exchanged glances. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house, took a step backward. Even Jennings's confident merchant smile faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about." But Hargrove's voice carried less conviction now. Silas looked around the circle of faces, seeing his neighbors and fellow townspeople with new clarity. How many of them knew? How many were involved? How many were simply too afraid to speak up? The girl's whispered words echoed in his mind. "They have others." Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. "Silas, perhaps we should all take a moment to—" "No." Silas cut him off, his voice carrying across the street. "No more taking moments. No more looking the other way." He raised the wire cutters toward the girl's shackles. The metallic click as he positioned them around the chain seemed to echo like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Sheriff Hargrove raised his weapon. "Last warning, Ward." But as Silas prepared to cut through the chain, the girl grabbed his wrist with both hands, her fingers digging in desperately. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly enough for half the street to hear. "They killed the last one who tried to help." The girl's words sent a shock through the gathered crowd that was almost visible. Several townspeople stepped back instinctively, and Silas heard Mrs. Patterson gasp audibly behind him. Sheriff Hargrove's gun hand trembled slightly, and for the first time since this confrontation began, Otis Jennings looked genuinely nervous. "She's lying," Hargrove said quickly, too quickly. "You know how they are, always making up stories." But Dr. Morrison had gone pale. The medical bag slipped from his fingers and hit the ground with a soft thud. "Tom Bradley," he whispered, barely audible. "Tom Bradley asked too many questions 3 months ago." The name hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Silas remembered Tom Bradley, a traveling merchant who'd stayed in town for a week, asking about missing native people from various tribes. They'd found his body in the river, written off as an accident, drunk and fallen in, according to the official report. "Shut up, Morrison." Hargrove's voice carried real menace now. "You don't know what you're talking about." But the doctor wasn't backing down. Years of seeing the aftermath of violence had apparently reached a breaking point. "I examined the body, Clyde. Those weren't drowning injuries. Someone beat Tom Bradley to death before he went in that water." The revelation rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Silas felt the girl's grip on his wrist tighten, but he also sensed something else, hope flickering in her dark eyes for the first time. Around them, whispered conversations began as townspeople processed what they'd just heard. Jennings tried to regain control of the situation. "Now see here, this is all wild speculation. We're talking about legal business transactions here. Nothing more. Business transactions." Silas's voice carried an edge that made several people flinch. "Is that what you call it when you chain human beings to posts?" "She's property," Jennings snapped, his merchant facade finally cracking. "Legally acquired property. The territorial government recognizes—" "Show me those papers again." Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his earlier fear replaced by cold anger. "Show me exactly what law says you can chain a person like an animal." Hargrove swung his gun toward Morrison. "That's enough from you, Doc." But the damage was already done. The crowd had heard enough to start connecting pieces they deliberately avoided seeing. Silas noticed how several people were looking at their neighbors with new suspicion, wondering who else knew, who else was involved. The girl released his wrist and stood as straight as her chains allowed. When she spoke again, her voice carried a strength that hadn't been there before. "There are 6 others, hidden in the old mine shaft north of town." This time the crowd's reaction was immediate and explosive. Angry voices rose, people pushed closer, and several townspeople began shouting questions at once. Through it all, Silas heard one voice that chilled him to the bone. Jennings whispering urgently to someone at the edge of the crowd. "Get word to the mine, now." Silas realized with crystal clarity that they were past the point of no return. The girl had just signed her own death warrant by revealing the location of the others. Unless he acted immediately, she'd disappear tonight, and the 6 others would be moved or worse. Sheriff Hargrove raised his gun higher, pointing it directly at Silas's chest. "Step away from her, Ward. Last chance." Instead, Silas positioned the wire cutters around the chain and looked directly into Hargrove's eyes. "You're going to have to shoot me, Clyde." The metallic snap of the chain breaking echoed like thunder across Cedar Hollow's main street. The broken chain fell to the dusty street with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo forever in the sudden silence. Sheriff Hargrove's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, the girl stepped directly between him and Silas. Her freed hands raised in a gesture that was both surrender and defiance. "My name is Ayanna," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the street. "I am daughter of Chief Running Bear of the Lakota people. For 3 months, they have kept us as slaves." The word slaves hit the crowd like a physical blow. Several townspeople stepped back, while others pushed forward, demanding answers. Mrs. Patterson began crying openly, her hands pressed to her mouth. Even some of the men who'd been standing with Jennings began to distance themselves, suddenly finding the ground more interesting than the merchant's face. Dr. Morrison picked up his medical bag and moved closer to Ayanna, his professional instincts overriding his fear. "Let me examine those injuries." "Stay back, Morrison." Hargrove swung his gun toward the doctor, but his authority was crumbling with each passing second. The crowd had grown larger, and their mood was shifting from curious to angry. Silas helped Ayanna sit on the wooden steps of the general store, noting how she favored her left side and the way her breathing seemed labored. Up close, he could see more evidence of systematic abuse. Carefully placed bruises that wouldn't show under clothing, rope burns that spoke of prolonged restraint, and a hollow look in her eyes that came from witnessing horrors. "How many people in this town knew?" Silas asked loudly, turning to face the crowd. "How many of you saw the signs and chose to ignore them?" The question sent uncomfortable murmurs through the gathering. Several people began looking at their neighbors with new suspicion. Silas noticed Mayor Henderson trying to slip away through the crowd, and the way blacksmith Jake Potter suddenly couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Jennings attempted to regain control. "This is all nonsense. Territorial law clearly states, 'Show us the mine.'" The interruption came from an unexpected source: Father Miguel, the elderly priest who rarely involved himself in town politics. His weathered face was set with quiet determination as he pushed through the crowd. "If what she says is true, show us the mine right now." "There's nothing to show," Hargrove snapped, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air. Ayanna struggled to stand, waving off Dr. Morrison's attempt to steady her. "They move us every few days. The mine, then the old warehouse by the creek, sometimes the root cellar behind the church." Her eyes found Father Miguel's. "Yes, behind your church, Father. They use the Lord's house to hide their evil." The priest's face went ashen. "The root cellar has been locked for months. I thought it was just storage." "Storage," Ayanna said bitterly. "That's what they call us." The crowd's anger was reaching a dangerous pitch. Voices were raised in heated argument. Fingers were being pointed, and Silas could see that Cedar Hollow was on the verge of tearing itself apart. But he also noticed something else. 3 men at the edge of the crowd were quietly mounting their horses and riding hard toward the north road, toward the mine. "They're warning the others," Silas called out, pointing toward the departing riders. "They're going to move the prisoners." Father Miguel stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of decades in the pulpit. "Then we go now. All of us. We end this today." Sheriff Hargrove raised his gun again, this time pointing it at the priest. "Nobody's going anywhere." But as he spoke, Silas heard the distinctive sound of rifle bolts being pulled back. He turned to see Dr. Morrison holding an old hunting rifle, its barrel trained steadily on the sheriff. Behind him, 3 more townspeople had produced weapons of their own. "Drop it, Clyde," Morrison said quietly. "It's over." Hargrove looked around desperately, realizing that the crowd had turned completely against him, but instead of surrendering, his face twisted into something ugly and desperate. "If I go down," he snarled, "I'm taking all of you with me." His finger moved toward the trigger, but not to shoot Silas or Morrison. He was aiming directly at Ayanna's heart. The crack of Dr. Morrison's rifle split the air before Hargrove could pull his trigger. The sheriff's gun flew from his hand as the bullet struck metal, and he stumbled backward, clutching his wrist. Blood seeped between his fingers, but Silas felt no sympathy for the man who'd been ready to murder an innocent girl in cold blood. Ayanna hadn't even flinched. She stood perfectly still, watching Hargrove writhe on the ground with an expression that held no satisfaction, only a weary recognition of violence she'd seen too many times before. "Tie him up," Father Miguel commanded, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Jake, get some rope from your shop." But as the blacksmith hurried away, Jennings made his move. The merchant had been slowly backing toward his store during the confrontation, and now he bolted for the rear exit. Silas started after him, but Ayanna caught his arm. "Let him run," she said urgently. "The others are more important. If those riders reach the mine, they're already moving my people." "Doctor." Morrison was binding Hargrove's wounded wrist with practiced efficiency, ignoring the sheriff's curses and threats. "How long to reach the mine?" he asked without looking up. 20 minutes hard riding," Silas replied. "But they've got a head start." Father Miguel stepped forward, his weathered hands surprisingly steady as he helped Ayanna to her feet. "The root cellar behind the church is closer. If they're moving prisoners, they might bring them there first." The priest's words galvanized the crowd. Men who'd been neighbors and friends that morning were now united in grim purpose, arming themselves with whatever weapons they could find. Silas noticed how naturally they looked to him for leadership, as if his simple act of cutting a chain had somehow made him responsible for what came next. "We split up," he decided. "Half to the mine, half to the church." "Father, you know that cellar better than anyone." The old priest nodded grimly. "There's only one entrance, but it connects to tunnels that run under the whole church. If they're using it as a prison—" He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. Underground tunnels meant hidden suffering, meant screams that wouldn't be heard above ground. As they prepared to move out, Ayanna grabbed Silas's sleeve. "There's something else you need to know. Jennings wasn't the only one. There are buyers coming from the territorial capital. Important men. They were supposed to arrive tomorrow." The implications hit Silas like a physical blow. This wasn't just a local problem. It was part of something much larger, with connections reaching all the way to the territorial government. Men with real power and influence were involved. Men who could make problems disappear, and witnesses die in convenient accidents. "Who?" Dr. Morrison demanded, having overheard. "What names?" Ayanna's voice dropped to a whisper. "I heard them talking. Judge Whitman, Territorial Representative Carson, someone they called the Colonel, but I never saw his face." The names sent shocked murmurs through the crowd. These weren't just local corrupt officials. These were men who shaped territorial law, men who could crush Cedar Hollow like an insect if they felt threatened. Father Miguel's face had gone pale. "Judge Whitman appointed me to this parish. He's been a benefactor to our church for years." His voice carried the weight of betrayal and lost innocence. Silas felt the enormity of what they were facing settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. They weren't just fighting local corruption anymore. They were taking on an entire network of powerful men who had the law, money, and political connections on their side. But as he looked around at the determined faces surrounding him, at Dr. Morrison checking his rifle, at Father Miguel clutching a prayer book in one hand and a shotgun in the other, at the townspeople who'd chosen conscience over safety, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. "Then we better move fast," he said grimly, "before those buyers arrive, and this whole thing disappears into the territorial capital, where we'll never touch it." As they prepared to ride out, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the north road. But instead of the 3 riders who'd left to warn the mine, a lone horseman was racing toward town at breakneck speed. When he got close enough to recognize, Silas felt his blood run cold. It was Jennings, and he was riding like the devil himself was behind him. But worse than his panicked flight was what he was shouting as he approached. "They're all dead! Everyone at the mine is dead!" Jennings pulled his lathered horse to a halt in the middle of the street, nearly falling from the saddle in his panic. His face was ashen, and his hands shook as he dismounted. Whatever he'd seen at the mine had stripped away every pretense of the confident merchant he'd been just an hour earlier. "What do you mean dead?" Silas demanded, grabbing Jennings by the shoulders. "The prisoners, the guards. Who's dead?" "All of them," Jennings gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "The 3 men who rode out, Henderson, the guards at the mine, bodies everywhere, and the prisoners." He doubled over, retching into the dust. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his medical training overriding his disgust for the man. "Otis, You need to tell us exactly what you saw. Jennings wiped his mouth with a trembling hand. Someone got there before us. The mine entrance was collapsed, but not by accident. Dynamite. Professional work. Bodies scattered around like they were caught by surprise. Ayana's face had gone rigid with controlled terror. My people. Are they gone? Jennings whispered. All 6 prisoners. Gone. But not dead. Not that I could see. Someone took them. The implications hit Silas like a physical blow. This wasn't random violence or an accident. Someone with resources and expertise had eliminated Jennings's operation and taken the prisoners. But who? And why now? Just when the truth was finally coming to light, Father Miguel spoke up, his voice tight with fear. The buyers you mentioned, Judge Whitman and the others, could they have? No. Jennings shook his head violently. They weren't supposed to arrive until tomorrow. Besides, they wanted the operation to continue, not destroy it. This was someone else. Dr. Morrison had been examining the bound Sheriff Hargrove during the conversation, but now he looked up with alarm. Clyde's unconscious. This isn't from the bullet wound. Someone drugged him. Silas felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place, none of them good. When did you last see him conscious? Just before Jennings rode back, Morrison replied grimly. Someone got close enough to administer something while we were all distracted. The realization sent a chill through the crowd. They'd been so focused on the drama unfolding in the street that they'd missed someone moving among them with deadly purpose. Someone who could collapse a mine with professional precision, eliminate multiple armed men, and drug a prisoner without being noticed. We need to get to the church, Silas said urgently. If they took the mine prisoners, the ones hidden behind the church might be next. But as they prepared to move, young Billy Henderson came running down the street, his face streaked with tears. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, and seeing him in such distress sent new alarm through the group. My pa, the boy sobbed as he reached them. Someone said my pa went to the mine. Is it true what Mr. Jennings said? Is my pa really? The crowd fell silent. Mayor Henderson had been one of the 3 riders who'd left to warn the mine. Looking at his son's terrified face, Silas felt the weight of what their actions had set in motion. In trying to do the right thing, they'd triggered something much bigger and more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. Dr. Morrison knelt beside the boy, his voice gentle. Billy, where's your mother right now? Home. She sent me to find Pa when he didn't come back for supper. The boy's eyes were wide with the kind of fear that only children feel when their world suddenly stops making sense. Ayana stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. Your father tried to do something he thought was right. Sometimes that's all a person can do. But before anyone could offer more comfort, the distinctive crack of rifle fire echoed from the direction of the church. Not one shot, but several in quick succession, followed by shouting and the sound of breaking wood. Father Miguel's face went white. The church. As they stood frozen for a moment by the sound of violence, Silas realized with crystal clarity that they were no longer dealing with local corruption or territorial politics. Someone was systematically eliminating everyone connected to this operation, and they were working with military precision. The question was whether Cedar Hollow's impromptu rescue party was about to become the next targets, or if they could somehow turn the tables on whoever was orchestrating this deadly game. Another burst of gunfire from the church made the decision for them. The ride to the church took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. As they approached, Silas could see smoke rising from behind the small wooden building, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the evening air. The shooting had stopped, but the silence that followed was somehow more ominous than the violence had been. Father Miguel dismounted first, his face etched with anguish as he surveyed his sanctuary. The church's rear wall had been partially destroyed, and the door to the root cellar hung open like a broken jaw. Bodies lay scattered in the churchyard, but they weren't wearing the clothes of townspeople or prisoners. Military uniforms, Dr. Morrison observed grimly, as he knelt beside one of the fallen men. But not territorial army. These markings, he examined the dead man's insignia more closely. I've never seen anything like them. Ayana moved past them toward the destroyed cellar entrance, her face set with grim determination. My people were here. I can smell them. She disappeared into the smoking ruins before anyone could stop her. Silas followed her down into what remained of the underground chamber. The scene that greeted them was both heartbreaking and confusing. The cellar had clearly been used as a prison. Shackles still hung from the walls, and the floor bore evidence of prolonged human habitation. But like at the mine, the prisoners were gone. "Here," Ayanna called softly from a corner of the damaged room. She was kneeling beside something carved into the wall, symbols that meant nothing to Silas but clearly held significance for her. "My cousin was here. Little Fox. She always carved these marks when she was frightened." As they examined the primitive prison, Silas began to notice details that painted a horrific picture. Scratch marks on the walls where fingernails had clawed at stone, stains that could only be blood, evidence of systematic brutality that made his stomach turn. But most disturbing were the signs of the recent battle. Whoever had attacked this place had done so with overwhelming force and precision. The uniformed men outside weren't guards. They were attackers who'd been killed while trying to breach the cellar. "Someone was protecting the prisoners," Dr. Morrison called from above ground. "These soldiers were shot from defensive positions around the church." The realization hit Silas with stunning force. The mysterious attackers weren't eliminating the operation. They were rescuing the prisoners. Someone with military resources and training had mounted a coordinated assault to free Ayanna's people. Father Miguel appeared at the cellar entrance, his face grave. "There's a survivor, one of the soldiers. He's badly wounded, but he's conscious." They found the injured man propped against the church steps, Dr. Morrison already working to stop his bleeding. The soldier's uniform was definitely military, but the insignia were unlike anything Silas had seen in his years of occasional contact with territorial forces. "Who are you?" Silas demanded. "Who sent you?" The soldier's eyes focused with effort. "Federal Marshals. Special Operations." Each word came with obvious pain, but he forced them out. "Investigating territorial corruption." The pieces began falling into place. The federal government had been watching the territorial administration, had discovered the slavery operation, and had sent in a military unit to gather evidence and rescue prisoners. But something had gone wrong. "Where are the prisoners now?" Ayanna asked urgently. The soldier's eyes found hers. "Safe. Extracted to federal facility. Protected witnesses." His breathing was becoming more labored. "But there's more. Bigger network. Judge Whitman just the beginning." Dr. Morrison looked up from his medical work, his face grim. "He's not going to make it. Lost too much blood." As if sensing his approaching death, the soldier grabbed Silas's shirt with surprising strength. "List. In my pocket. Names of everyone involved. Territory governor. 3 judges. Dozens of officials." His grip tightened. "They know. Operation's blown. They'll run or eliminate witnesses." Silas found the folded paper in the soldier's breast pocket. The names listed there sent shockwaves through him, not just territorial officials, but federal appointees, wealthy businessmen from back east. Even a senator's name appeared near the bottom. "How deep does this go?" Father Miguel whispered, reading over his shoulder. The dying soldier managed one last sentence. "Hundreds of prisoners, dozen locations, been going on for years." As the federal agent drew his last breath, Silas realized that their small act of defiance in Cedar Hollow's Main Street had accidentally uncovered something monstrous. They weren't just dealing with local corruption. They'd stumbled into a territory-wide network that reached all the way to Washington. But before he could fully process the implications, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the evening air. Not just a few riders, but many. The thundering hoofbeats grew louder, and Silas counted at least 20 horses, maybe more. Ayanna grabbed his arm, her face pale with recognition. "That's not federal cavalry. I know the sound of their horses from the reservation. Those are territorial militia." As the riders crested the hill overlooking the church, Silas saw she was right. The approaching force wore territorial uniforms and flew official flags. But given what they just learned about territorial corruption, their arrival was not good news. The lead rider called out as they approached, his voice carrying the authority of official command. "By order of Territorial Governor Whitman, you are all under arrest for interference with federal property and assault on territorial personnel." Judge Whitman himself rode with the militia, his face cold with fury as he surveyed the scene. When his eyes found the list still clutched in Silas's hand, his expression turned murderous. Silas held up the blood-stained list, his voice carrying across the churchyard with calm authority. "Before you arrest anyone, Judge Whitman, you might want to explain to your men why their names are on a federal investigation list for human trafficking." The words struck the militia like a physical blow. Several riders exchanged uncertain glances. and Silas noticed more than a few hands moving away from their weapons. These weren't hardened criminals. They were territorial militiamen who'd been told they were arresting criminals, not participating in a cover-up. Judge Whitman's face flushed with rage. That's a fabrication. Territorial authority supersedes any supposed federal investigation. Does it? Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his voice steady despite the 20 rifles trained on their small group. Because that federal agent dying right there said different. He said you're all under investigation by Washington. Ayanna moved to stand beside Silas, her presence lending weight to his words. These men kept my people in chains like animals. 6 others are already safe in federal custody, ready to testify about what happened here. The militia captain, a weathered man named Collins whom Silas recognized from occasional visits to town, lowered his rifle slightly. Judge, is this true? Are we mixed up in something involving federal prisoners? You're soldiers, Whitman snapped. You follow orders, not rumors. But Collins was studying the scene more carefully now. The destroyed prison cellar, the dead federal agent, the evidence of systematic brutality. These don't look like rumors, Judge. This looks like a crime scene. Silas pressed the advantage. Captain Collins, your name isn't on this list. Neither are most of your men's. You still have a choice here. The moment stretched taut as Collins weighed his options. 20 years of military service had taught him to recognize when his commanding officer was leading him into a dishonorable situation. Around him, his men were coming to the same realization. Father Miguel stepped forward, his voice carrying the moral authority of his calling. Captain, I've served this community for 15 years. I've never lied to you or any of your men. What we discovered today is an abomination that shames us all, but you can still choose to stand with justice. The captain's decision came swiftly. He turned his rifle toward Judge Whitman, and one by one, his men followed suit. Judge, you're under arrest for violations of federal law and crimes against territorial citizens. Whitman's face went white as he realized his authority had evaporated completely. You can't do this. I am the territorial judge. I have connections in Washington. I'll have you all court-martialed. Your connections are on that list too, Silas replied grimly. The federal government is cleaning house, starting with you. As Captain Collins and his men secured Whitman and the few militiamen who'd remained loyal to the corrupt judge, Silas felt a profound transformation settling over him. 3 hours ago, he'd been a quiet rancher who minded his own business. Now he was a man who'd helped expose a territory-wide criminal conspiracy and save innocent lives. Dr. Morrison was organizing the townspeople to tend to the wounded and secure evidence. Father Miguel was conducting last rites for the fallen federal agent. The community of Cedar Hollow had been forever changed by what they'd witnessed and the choices they'd made. Ayanna approached Silas as the immediate chaos subsided. My people are safe now. The federal marshals will protect them until they can return to their families. She paused, studying his face. What you did today, cutting those chains, it saved more than just me. Silas looked around at the churchyard, at the evidence of suffering and the promise of justice finally being served. A man's got to choose between being comfortable and being able to sleep at night. My father told me that once. Your father raised a good son. As the sun set over Cedar Hollow, federal reinforcements arrived to take Judge Whitman and his accomplices into custody. The territorial corruption network would be thoroughly investigated and dismantled. The rescued prisoners would be reunited with their families. And Silas Ward, the quiet rancher who'd seen something wrong and decided to act, could finally sleep at night knowing he'd made the right choice. Justice had come to Cedar Hollow, carried in the hands of ordinary people who'd found extraordinary courage when it mattered most. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.